A black man took in a homeless child. Years later, he arrived at the last second and stopped his execution. Jamal Thomas was a man who had seen the harshest side of life. Once a proud father of three, he now lived alone, having buried his wife and watched his children grow into adults who had long since lost touch with him. But fate wasn't finished with Jamal. It had one more cruel twist in store. One cold, dark evening, Jamal found a boy huddled in a forgotten alley behind a run-down grocery store. The child, pale with hunger, looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes, as though asking for help. Jamal didn't hesitate. His own heart had once been cold, but something about the boy's fragile frame, his silent pleas, struck a chord deep inside. Without a second thought, Jamal took the boy in. He named him Elijah. His own life had been full of struggles, but he found strength in the child, feeding him, protecting him, and raising him with the love he had left to give. Through years of hardship, Jamal poured everything into Elijah. He worked long, grueling shifts at a factory, barely scraping by, but he never complained. He sacrificed his last meal for the boy, pawned his belongings for school supplies, and weathered the whispers from the neighbors. "You can't save him," they said. "He's not your blood. It's not gonna work." But Jamal didn't listen. Years passed, and Elijah grew into a young man. He became a scholar, excelling in school and showing an ambition Jamal had never imagined possible. But while Elijah's future seemed limitless, Jamal's past caught up with him. One fateful day, Jamal's former employer, Daniel Green, accused him of a crime he didn't commit. The allegations were false, a desperate attempt to silence a man who had once worked for him. And when the trial came, the courtroom turned against Jamal. "Thief, liar, unworthy of mercy." The words rang through the air like poison. Jamal sat at the defendant's table, his back bent from years of hard labor, his hands shackled. His once proud voice was now a whisper. The prosecutor painted him as a desperate, bitter man willing to betray anyone for a few extra dollars. Witnesses, people Jamal had once trusted, testified against him.
But just when all hope seemed lost, the doors to the courtroom burst open. "Stop!" Every head turned. The echo of that single word shook the air like thunder. There in the doorway stood Elijah, the boy Jamal had raised from the streets, and now the man who would stop at nothing to save the father who had given him everything. The winter had a brutal bite that year, a bone-chilling cold that cut through even the thickest coats. The streets of Detroit, worn and crumbling from years of industrial neglect, smelled of steel, burning rubber, and the hollow echoes of a city that had seen better days. Men trudged home from the factory, with their collars pulled tight against the wind, their breath visible in the frigid air. No one took notice of the child shivering in the shadows, his breath fogging up the cold night. Jamal Thomas, a man in his early 50s, walked the same route home every day. His back hunched from years of hard labor, his hands calloused and rough from the years spent working in the steel mill. The weight of his life pressed down on him like an invisible chain. His employer, Stephen Harlan, had made it clear over the years that Jamal was nothing more than a tool, a broken one at that. "Too slow, Thomas. You're lucky you're still here, but I don't expect much from you." Jamal never fought back. He was used to the insults, the unfair treatment, the disregard for his dignity. But it still stung, every single time. That night, as the icy wind cut through the streets, Jamal's worn boots crunched on the frozen ground. He was headed to his tiny apartment, the only place that felt like his, despite its peeling walls and creaking floors. He thought about his late wife, Leela, and their children who had all gone their separate ways. The loneliness of his small apartment was a constant reminder of what he had lost. He passed the old diner on the corner, the one with the flickering neon sign, when something stopped him. A muffled cough reached his ears, thin and desperate. He paused, a chill running down his spine. The sound was coming from the alley next to the diner.
He turned into the alley, the smell of grease and old garbage hanging heavy in the air. There, huddled against a dumpster, was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. His jacket was torn and his shoes were soaked through with snow. The boy's face was pale, his skin nearly ashen, and his eyes, wide, fearful, hollow, looked up at Jamal with silent pleading. Jamal's heart tightened. He could have walked away. He could have ignored the boy, just like everyone else. But something inside him wouldn't let him. He saw in that boy the same loneliness he had carried for years, the same sense of abandonment. Jamal kneeled slowly, his knees creaking, and reached out with his rough hands. "You got anywhere to go, son?" His voice was low, steady, but there was a tremble in it, an unspoken sorrow that he couldn't hide. The boy shook his head, his lips a faint blue from the cold. His hands trembled violently, and Jamal could feel his own heart breaking. Without a word, Jamal extended his hand, and after a brief hesitation, the boy's tiny, ice-cold fingers slipped into his palm. That was it. It was done. By the time they reached Jamal's apartment, the whispers from the neighbors were already spreading like wildfire. "He's a fool," one of them muttered from behind a cracked door. "He can't even feed himself, and now he's taken in a stray." Another voice followed. "He's doomed. He'll never make it." But Jamal didn't care. He had lived long enough in a world that judged him, that told him he was nothing. He was used to it. But he wouldn't let that boy become just another casualty of a world that didn't care. He laid a blanket on the couch and warmed up what little broth he had left. The boy ate greedily, as though he hadn't tasted food in days, maybe longer. Jamal watched him in silence, his thoughts heavy with what had just happened. In that moment, he made a silent vow. This child, Elisha, would never know the cold of an alley again. As long as Jamal had breath in his body, Elisha would have a home, a father, someone who would fight for him. The next few days passed in a blur of exhaustion. Jamal woke up every morning before dawn, his body aching from the factory work, the long shifts, the physical toll it had taken on him over the years. But now, there was more to it. There was a boy at home waiting for him, a boy who needed him. The weight of responsibility made the daily grind a little more bearable, even if the world outside wasn't any kinder. The steel mill was unforgiving, and so was his boss, Stephen Harlan. Jamal was used to the insults, the belittling comments. "You think raising some street rat makes you a hero?" Harlan would sneer across the factory floor. "That kid's gonna end up just like you, useless." Jamal kept his head down. He had heard it all before, every insult, every cruel remark. The factory workers around him laughed, some out of fear, others simply because cruelty was easier than kindness. But Jamal remained silent. The weight of his limp growing heavier with each passing day. He could feel the stares of his co-workers, the judgmental whispers behind his back. Yet all that mattered to him now was the boy who waited for him at home. At night, the burden lifted. The boy, Elijah, waited at the window, his small face fogging the glass as he searched for Jamal's shadow on the stairwell. When the door creaked open, Elijah jumped to his feet, clutching a chipped bowl. "I saved soup for you," he said proudly, though the broth was thin and the bowl barely half full. Jamal smiled anyway. Inside these thin walls, peeling paint, a rattling heater, a couch that groaned like an old ship, something sturdier than comfort began to grow. Hope. Jamal stretched his wages until they screamed. He gave Elijah the larger portions, pawned his wedding band to buy the boy a decent coat, and bartered an old radio for secondhand textbooks. The neighbors whispered in stairwells and shops.
He'll starve with that child. Not even his blood. You watch, this ends badly. Jamal heard it all. He always had. He refused to let their poison in. One evening, as Jamal patched Elijah's torn jacket with clumsy stitches, the boy asked, almost afraid to break the quiet, "Why are you doing this for me?" Jamal paused, the needle glinting.
"Because once someone left me too," he said. "I know that cold. I won't let the world do that to you." Elijah blinked hard, fighting tears. "Then I'll make you proud. I promise." He kept the vow. Elijah learned faster than hunger. He brought home library books by the armful, reading to Jamal by the lamp's weak glow, stories about bridges and courtrooms, inventions and ideas. His voice filled the tiny apartment with a future bigger than the building. "Listen, Pops," he'd grin, showing a test inked with a perfect score. Jamal pinned each paper to the cracked wall as if it were gold. Still, danger loomed. One brutal winter fever took Elijah by the collar and slammed him into bed. Jamal begged Harlan for a day off. "You're not his father," Harlan sneered across the mill floor. "Stop pretending. He's not your blood." Jamal's jaw set. Blood don't make family. That night, Harlan slashed Jamal's pay in half. Jamal folded the pay stub into his pocket, came home smiling anyway, and sat through the night changing cool cloths on Elijah's brow, whispering prayers into the space between breaths. Spring came like a second chance. Elijah shot up in inches and certainty. By 14, he was standing on cafeteria tables organizing tutoring groups. By 15, he was on stage turning debates into thunder. Teachers whispered his name with pride. Neighbors who once mocked now watched from doorways puzzled, as if kindness had broken a law they didn't know. Harlan didn't soften. He curdled. Each of Elijah's medals felt to him like a left-handed insult, a reminder that a man he called useless had raised a son the city could not ignore. He started planting rumors in the break room, feeding suspicion with a smile. "Reckon Thomas found a way to skim. Where else he get money for that boy's books?" The lies moved quick, gathering weight when they rolled downhill. Jamal kept working, shoulders bent, hands steady. He refused to break. He also refused a request that would have bought him an easy month. Harlan wanted him to sign off on a shipment that skipped safety checks. Jamal shook his head. "Not my name." Harlan's grin didn't reach his eyes. "Careful you don't trip over that pride." One night, Jamal came home from a double shift to find Elijah asleep at the table, his head on an open law textbook, highlighter uncapped beside his hand. A lamp shivered over the page. Jamal stood in the doorway, a warmth in his chest he hadn't felt in decades. He tucked a blanket over Elijah and whispered, "Be the man I couldn't, and don't let anyone take it from you." The more Elijah rose, the narrower the hallway felt when Jamal left for work. He could sense storm clouds gathering, something sour in Harlan's greetings, a hush that followed Jamal from locker to station. He clutched one of Elijah's medals in his palm sometimes, tracing the edge with his thumb, and promised himself he'd weather whatever came without letting the boy see the cost. Late that summer, Elijah won a citywide debate. Topic: whether justice can exist without mercy. Afterward, he found Jamal outside the auditorium, standing by the door like a sentinel, hands in his coat pockets, eyes bright. "We did it, Pops," Elijah said, the ribbon catching the streetlight. "No," Jamal answered, voice thick. "You did. The rest is mine to carry." The rest arrived sooner than either expected. It came on a Wednesday, gray and ordinary. A missing ledger, a whispered tip, 2 officers at Jamal's door, and Harlan's smile waiting across the street like winter. The officers pushed their way into Jamal's apartment with little resistance, as if they already knew what they were looking for. The doors swung open with a creak that echoed through the hallway. Jamal stood frozen, his heart sinking with every step they took, knowing the fate that was about to unfold.
He watched as they tore through the modest rooms, rifling through drawers, flipping over cushions, pulling apart the couch that had long since seen better days. His stomach churned as they finally reached the back of the couch and pulled out a canvas bag, its contents clinging like the sound of doom. Cash, factory tools, stamped with the company logo, all the things Jamal had never seen in his life. He could feel the weight of the world shifting as the officers moved toward him, their eyes cold, their hands gripping the cuffs. "That's not mine," Jamal muttered, his voice trembling. "I don't know where that came from." But it didn't matter. They weren't listening to him. The chain of accusations had already been set in motion. One officer slapped cold, unforgiving cuffs around his wrists, and the other began reading him his rights, his body moving automatically, too numb to react. His head spun with confusion, but the only thing that cut through the haze was the thought of Elijah, his son, the boy he had raised, the one thing in this world he could still call his own. Across the street, standing at the factory gates, was Stephen Harlan. He watched with a smirk, his arms folded across his chest. "Guess kindness doesn't pay after all, huh?" he called out, loud enough for the other workers to hear. Some of them chuckled, others turned away in silence. The weight of the community's judgment settled over Jamal like a shroud, and he felt the sting of betrayal like a punch to the gut. They didn't believe in him. They never had. They never would. The neighbors, who had once only whispered behind closed doors, now shouted openly. "I knew he was no good! Stealing from the very place that fed him!" Their words wrapped around Jamal like chains, the bitterness thickening with each passing second. He lowered his head, trying to ignore them, trying to fight back the sting of their cruelty. But all he could think about was Elijah, the boy he had promised to protect. He couldn't bear the thought of Elijah hearing these lies, of seeing his father cast as a criminal. As the police car doors slammed shut, Jamal glanced one last time at the world outside, the world that had never given him a chance, the world that was about to take everything from him. He saw Elijah's face flash in his mind, and then everything faded to black as the car engine roared to life. Inside the police station, Jamal sat in a cold metal chair, hands cuffed to the table, his heart pounding. He had never been in trouble before. He had always worked hard, always kept his head down. Yet here he was, caught in a web of lies spun by the one man who had hated him since the first day they met. He could feel the weight of his life pressing down on him, each breath harder than the last. But then, something unexpected happened. As the days dragged on, word spread. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the factory floors, through the break rooms, through the streets. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a story. Some of them were the same ones that had been told 100 times over, repeating what they had heard from others. But others began to question. "Elijah Cross," someone murmured. "Isn't he the kid Thomas raised, the one who went on to do something with his life?" By the time the courtroom date arrived, the town was divided. For some, Jamal was the thief they had always suspected him to be. For others, he was the man who had done something for a boy no one else had cared for. The trial, for many, was more than just a trial. It was a spectacle, a chance to see a man they had already condemned finally fall. Inside the courtroom, Jamal sat at the defendant's table, the weight of the chains biting into his skin. The room was filled with the sounds of murmurs and whispers, the sharp scent of old wood and varnish, the cold, sterile air that seemed to settle over everything. His eyes were fixed on the floor, his face a mask, his hands trembling slightly in his lap. He had expected this, had expected the lies, the betrayal, the cruelty, but nothing could have prepared him for the moment that came next. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced woman in her 40s, stood and addressed the jury with authority. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "This case is not complicated.
The defendant, Jamal Thomas, stole from his employer. He betrayed the trust of the people who gave him a job, a chance at redemption, and he did it for his own gain. She gestured toward the bag of cash and factory tools displayed at the front of the room. These were found in his home, hidden, sequestered away like a man preparing to flee with stolen goods. Jamal's heart raced. He tried to speak, to say something, anything, but the words caught in his throat. The evidence was stacked against him, and all he could do was sit there and take it. He thought of Elijah again, his son, who had come from nothing, who had been shaped by Jamal's love and sacrifice. He didn't deserve this. None of it was true.
One by one, the witnesses took the stand. Men who had worked with Jamal for years, men he had once called friends. They spoke with practiced ease, recounting stories of late nights spent in the factory, of things that were never meant to be known. They spoke of seeing Jamal in places he shouldn't have been, of witnessing his desperation, his need for something more than the life he had. But each word was like a knife, twisting deeper into Jamal's chest. "I saw him sneaking around the storage rooms late at night," one man testified, "always acting like he was hiding something." Another spoke, his voice thick with the weight of his accusation. "Everyone knew Jamal was desperate, took in a kid he couldn't even feed. This was his only way to survive." The words pierced through Jamal's heart like shards of glass, but he stayed silent. He couldn't bring himself to protest, not while Elijah was still out there, waiting for him. By the time the prosecutor finished her closing cadence, "Justice demands nothing less than a maximum sentence," the room felt sealed shut, like air had weight. The judge lifted his gavel, lips parting to pronounce the words that would turn Jamal's life into a number. "Stop!" It cracked across the chamber like thunder. Heads whipped toward the doors. Elijah stood framed in the light from the hallway, tall now, shoulders squared, a dark suit cut clean along his lines. He didn't move until the noise died on its own. Then he walked, measured, deliberate, down the aisle that had never been made for him, a leather folio tucked beneath his arm. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady but bright with heat. "Elijah Thomas, licensed by the State Bar. I am entering an appearance to represent the defendant." He set a card on the clerk's desk, then held out a stamped motion. "Emergency substitution of counsel and motion to reopen the record." The prosecutor sprang up. "Objection!" The judge brought the gavel down once. "Counsel, approach." Papers rustled, a murmured exchange, a skeptical brow, a glance at the file, and then the nod that turns a tide. "Granted. Proceed." Jamal lifted his head, as if the bench itself had called his name. Elijah looked at him, just for a heartbeat, and the years between alley and courtroom collapsed. He leaned near, low enough that only his father could hear. "You saved me first. Now let me do it right."
Elijah faced the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you were told a story about theft, desperation, and betrayal, but stories can be bent. Truth, however, carries a record." He opened the folio. Tabs flashed, blue for timesheets, yellow for camera logs, red for payroll, green for shipping. "Let's begin where the lies start." He called the first witness back, the man who had claimed he saw Jamal in the storage wing after hours. Elijah's voice never rose. It tightened. "Sir, you testified you saw my client at 10:37 p.m. on March 8th in the storage corridor, correct?" The man nodded, hesitant. Elijah placed a document on the stand. "Your time card shows you punched out at 12:03 p.m. that day and never returned. Security exit footage confirms your car left the lot at 12:19 p.m. He slid a still frame forward, license plate clear, timestamp plain. "Help me reconcile that." A flush climbed the witness's neck. "I must have remembered wrong." "Or," Elijah said, soft enough to sting, "you were asked to remember wrong."
Who told you what to say? The man stared at his hands. Silence stretched, then snapped. Mr. Harlan, he said the company needed protection. A low roar rolled through the gallery. The judge's gavel hammered for order. Elijah called another. The foreman, who'd sworn he found the canvas bag wedged beneath Jamal's couch. He waited until the oath settled. Sir, you filed a maintenance report the same night, 5:52 p.m., claiming a broken latch on the mill's secured tool cage. He held up the report, then a grainy photo. But the latch wasn't broken, it was removed, and the tools missing from the cage matched the stamps photographed in the canvas bag. Whoever filled that bag had a spare key. He tapped the line on the maintenance log. The only people with spare keys are supervisors, like Stephen Harlan. You signed the maintenance slip. He countersigned 3 hours before Jamal's shift ended. He let the timing hang. Did Mr. Harlan ask you to place that bag? The foreman's jaw worked. His eyes flicked to Harlan, who sat 3 rows back, arms locked, a smile that had forgotten how to breathe. He told me where to look, said it would be there. Not quite the same as finding it yourself, Elijah replied.
He moved, clean, relentless, through red tab payroll sheets. These show that Mr. Harlan cut Jamal's wages the week Jamal refused to sign off on an unsafe shipment. That same week, a ledger page went missing. The very ledger that would track who had custody of the tool cage key. He laid down a green tab shipping manifest. And here, Mr. Harlan approved a rush order that skipped inspection. My father refused. That refusal created motive. He called the guard who'd manned the camera station. Did anyone ask you to lose footage from March 8th between 9 p.m. and 11 p.m.? The guard tried to angle bravado into innocence. It fell flat. Mr. Harlan said the system glitched. Elijah held up a thumb drive. The backup doesn't glitch, it mirrors. The judge signaled, and the clerk displayed a screen. A hallway with a door labeled Supervisor Access Only. 10:32 p.m. Harlan, alone, slipping inside with a canvas bag. The room inhaled and didn't find breath again for a full beat. Elijah let quiet do its work. Then he turned, not to the jury, but to the man who had sneered at a good deed for years. Mr. Harlan, you have not been called, but I'll ask you plainly, did you orchestrate a false narrative to punish a man for saying no? Harlan didn't answer. He didn't need to. His face wore the truth. Jamal's hands trembled against the chain, not with fear now, but with something dangerous and bright. Hope. Elijah's last witness was not a man, but a piece of paper time forgot to hide. An email from Harlan to the foreman. It was short. It was enough. Make sure we tighten the story. He closed the folio. You were asked to convict a man whose greatest crime is generosity. But mercy is not weakness. Dignity is not theft. My father is not a liar, not a cheat, not a number you can lock away. He is a man who chose love over hunger, duty over comfort, and truth over fear. The evidence is not merely reasonable doubt, it is proof of a frame. Silence fell with a kind of respect it hadn't shown when the day began.
The judge removed his glasses and stared at Harlan for a long time, as if measuring the size of a lie. Then he spoke, each word its own verdict. The testimonies against the defendant are inconsistent, compromised, and, in several instances, coerced. The state's physical evidence is tainted. The defense has presented credible proof of deliberate manipulation by Mr. Harlan. He turned to Jamal. The sternness in his face softened. Mr. Thomas,
The charges against you are hereby dismissed. You are free to go." The chain at Jamal's wrists fell away with a click that sounded louder than applause. But applause followed, ragged at first, then a wave. Reporters stood, pens skittering across pads. Neighbors who had once watched from cracked doorways stared as if witnessing a law of gravity reversed. Elijah touched his father's shoulder. "It's over," he said. Jamal stood slowly, as if learning balance anew. He faced the man he had raised, the man he had loved into becoming. "You shouldn't have had to save me," he whispered. Elijah shook his head. "You taught me how." At the back of the room, Harlan shoved through the aisle, the power stripped from his stride. Cameras found him. Questions bit. "Did you pay for testimony? Did you falsify logs? Were you retaliating?" He did not answer. The door swallowed him whole. The judge's gavel fell one last time, not a sentence, but a benediction. Freedom had a sound. Silence fell over the courtroom, the kind of silence that speaks louder than any gavel. The judge raised his head, his stern expression softening for the first time. He lifted his gavel one last time and spoke. "Jamal Thomas, the charges against you are hereby dismissed. You are free to go." The room erupted. The sound was deafening. Some clapped, others stood in stunned silence, their faces a mix of disbelief and awe. Reporters scrambled to capture every moment, their cameras flashing in a frenzy. Neighbors who had once whispered behind closed doors now sat frozen, unable to say a word. The poison of judgment that had once hung over Jamal's life was silenced by the roar of vindication. At the defense table, Elijah placed a firm hand on his father's shoulder. "It's over, Pops," he whispered. "You're free." Jamal's breath caught, his vision blurred, the weight of the word free almost too much to bear. For so many years, he had carried the burden of shame, of being the man the world had cast aside, but now, in this single moment, that weight had been lifted. Across the room, Stephen Harlan shoved past the benches, his face purple with rage. Reporters surged around him, firing questions like bullets. "Mr. Harlan, did you bribe witnesses? Were you involved in wage theft? How long have you been exploiting workers?" Harlan shoved them aside, his smirk gone, his power stripped bare. The man who had once mocked Jamal in front of the factory now fled, his dignity shattered. The bailiff stepped forward and unlocked the chains around Jamal's wrists. The sound of metal falling away rang louder than the cheers that filled the room. Jamal lifted his head slowly, his shoulders straightening. For the first time in years, his eyes met the world without shame. He turned to Elijah, his lips trembling. "You shouldn't have had to save me," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Elijah shook his head, steady and firm. "You saved me first." The gavel came down one final time, but it wasn't a sentence. It was a declaration of freedom. And in that moment, Jamal Thomas, the man who had been discarded by the world, stood taller than he ever had in his life. The courthouse doors creaked open, and for the first time in months, Jamal stepped into the sunlight, free from the chains that had bound him for so long. The air felt different, cleaner, almost too bright to believe. He raised a trembling hand to shield his eyes, as though the very notion of freedom was too sharp, too real to face all at once. Beside him, Elijah walked tall, steady, every step filled with the strength of a man who had learned from the best.
The cameras surged forward, voices shouting questions. "Mr. Thomas, how does it feel to be free? Elijah, what made you come back for him? Do you have anything to say about Harlan?" Jamal didn't answer them. He wasn't thinking about Harlan, or the whispers, or the years of cruelty. His eyes were fixed only on Elijah, the boy he had once found shivering in an alley, now the man who had stood before a judge and pulled him back from the brink of a life sentence. Elijah glanced at him, his voice low but certain. "It's done, Pops. You don't have to carry it alone anymore." Jamal's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, but no words could express what he was feeling. Instead, he reached out with his calloused hands, gripping Elijah's shoulder tightly. Tears slipped down his cheeks, freely now, unashamed. "You were the one thing I did right. I thought kindness had broken me, but it saved me." Elijah held his gaze, steady as stone. "Kindness doesn't break us, Dad. It builds us. You built me, and now the world knows it." Together, they descended the courthouse steps. The crowd parted, cameras flashing, but to Jamal, it all faded into the background. The only sound that mattered was the steady rhythm of his son's footsteps beside his own. For decades, Jamal had given everything he had, his meals, his wages, his strength, for a boy he did not owe. And now, in a moment when he needed it most, that boy had given everything back to him. It was proof of a truth Jamal had always believed, but never dared to speak. Kindness never dies. It waits, it grows, and when the time is right, it saves.
If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because sacrifice is never wasted, love is never forgotten, and kindness always finds its way back home.